Okay, so I think we might make a start if that's all right. Thank you everyone for coming this afternoon. I know it's a really nice day outside, so it's a bit of a sacrifice, but I really appreciate it. So hello everyone and welcome to the Bayside Community Forum on Refugees and Aid. It's really exciting to be able to have such good speakers as we have this afternoon to be able to discuss some really important issues affecting our country and our region of the world. And so that's what we're going to be doing this afternoon. My name's Jason, I'll be your MC this afternoon. So I'll be asking some questions of our speakers, I'll be introducing them, doing those sorts of things. You'll also get the chance to ask your own questions and have your own say later, but that'll be in the second part of the forum. But before we start, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. So the purpose of today's forum is pretty simple, I think, but it's also quite ambitious. It's to gain greater insight about one of the most significant challenges that our world has faced from a humanitarian point of view for many years, and to think more deeply about what we can do as Australians, as a nation, individually as well, to help. And so to this end, we'll be having 6 fantastic speakers. I know that there's only 5 on there at the moment, but Tim Costello is on his way. And those speakers will be former refugee Shabnam Safa, the member for Hotham, Clare, the member for Goldstein, Mr. Tim Wilson, Pastor Rob Buckingham of Bayside Church. I'd like to thank Pastor Rob for letting us use this auditorium this evening. It's a really fantastic setting. And as well as Vanessa Forrest from World Vision, who's a humanitarian advisor there. So could you please join me in welcoming all of our speakers? Thank you. So our first speaker this afternoon is Shabnam Safa. Shabnam is a refugee originally from Afghanistan who was raised in Pakistan and then settled in Australia in 2009. Since arriving here, she's been able to set up a not-for-profit called the Neuroscience Foundation, which helps migrants and other people coming to Australia to settle here, which is really good. Shabnam has also been able to give a number of speeches to a whole heap of forums, talking about how we can better embrace the diversity and the really good values that people who are new to Australia can bring. So if you could join me in welcoming Shabnam Safa.
Thanks, Jason. Now I have been only given 5 minutes and I don't know how I'm going to tell you my entire life story in those 5 minutes. So I'll do very quick snippets. If things don't make sense, just come find me afterwards and I'm more than happy to explain things to you. So just to begin, I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on today and pay my respect to their history, culture and leaders past, present and emerging. I would also like to remind you all that just as each of us as human beings have very different stories, same goes for refugees. There is no one refugee narrative, there is no one refugee story, and I in no way represent every refugee there is out there, and my story is my story, which would be very different to even my brother at home. He's had a very different life. So as Jason said, I did grow up in Pakistan as an Afghan refugee over there, and then I moved to Australia in 2009 when I was 15 with my family as under the Australian Global Special Humanitarian Program. The funny thing was that was the only time, that was the first time I was actually given the label refugee, and I realised that I was a refugee whilst I had been living my life as a refugee for the past 15 years. The reason for that was because I did grow up in a very small town in Pakistan. It's called, the city is called Quetta, if you've got really good geography knowledge. And then in Quetta, there is a very small town called the Hazara town. Now, I don't know how much you know about Afghanistan and the ethnicities of Afghanistan, but one of the minority ethnicities are the Hazaras in Afghanistan. And if you've watched The Kite Runner, or if you've, I don't know, any of those movies, you probably might be aware of the prejudice, discrimination and persecution against those that group of people in Afghanistan. Now, luckily, I didn't have to really experience that because my parents made a very smart decision to run away when they could, when I was very, very little. They left their entire life behind. They were very politically active and engaged in Afghanistan's social affair at that time, and that costed them a lot of things, and they basically made the ultimate decision to leave everything behind and go to Pakistan. We, the children, we grew up in Pakistan in a very small town called Hazara Town, and you guessed it, the people who lived there were all Hazara refugees from Afghanistan. So for the first 15 years of my life, I grew up around people who dressed the exact same way I dressed, who looked exactly like I did, and who ate the same food, who talked in the same language. Everything was the same. It felt like I lived in this massive family of, I don't know, thousands and thousands of people in this small town. And then one day the news came that we were going to go to Australia. Now, at that stage, what I knew about the outside world was basically what I had seen on TV. That's all I knew. And I do remember on the first week when we had come to Australia, I went back to my parents and I was like, maybe we got scammed, or maybe we got tricked because this is not how I imagined Australia to be, or, you know, how I thought it would be like. I was the only one in the family who had a little bit of English. My parents had invested some funds into having at least one person in the family be able to talk English. And now over there in schools, we don't get taught English. It's not part of the curriculum. So if you want your child to learn, or if anybody wants to learn, you have to go pay private tutors, private instructors, and they teach you English. Now, I thought I knew English until I actually came to Australia. And I could not understand a single word. And so then my parents would turn to me and be like, did you actually go to classes? Did you know? It was all of that for nothing. It was very, very frustrating because when I went to school to give an exam to see, they did a general test to see if I needed to go to the language school or stay in mainstream school. They thought when I wrote everything down, they're like, your English is excellent. I didn't understand that part because I didn't really get the accent. But when I would speak, or when people would speak to me, that was it. That was the end of my English. So it took me a while about a couple of months to sort of get the hang of Aussie English. Bad news for my brothers, they had to go to language school and then come to main school after that. So I grew up as a refugee girl in a country that completely denied our existence, said that, this particular part, or Quetta is in general, as a city, just does not belong to us because it's full of Afghan refugees and we don't really care about them. When I came here, I was in year 12 in Pakistan. I was 14 at that stage, and that's because over there there's absolutely no rule against or for your education, like you need to be a certain age, none of that exists. If you can convince your teachers that you're smarter than everyone else, they would put you one class up. And that was the case with me too. So I came here and I had to go through a lot of convincing, but my teachers didn't really get convinced, and they were like, no, you are 14, you need to sit in year 9. That was a huge change for me. I'm glad that happened because I got to experience the high school experience here in Australia, and that also gave me some extra time to parent my family on the side as well. Now, knowing that I was the only person who knew English in the family, I literally became the parent of the family. Not only had I had to look after my siblings, but I also had to look after my parents and all the expectations that they had from Australia. At one stage, I think during our orientation before coming to Australia, they were told that you do not chuck any letter out. Whatever you get in your mailbox, you have to look at everything carefully, because over there we had no mailboxes, we had no numbers, our streets had no names, nobody got letters, like those things didn't exist over there. And I remember at least for the first year, every week we had a sit-down session where I would sit down and I literally translate everything word by word, no matter if it was a letter from my school or, if it was a Centrelink letter or a junk mail from Coles or Aldi. I had to literally translate every single thing until I got tired of it. Like, come on, Mum and Dad, this is just selling groceries. You don't really need to understand these things. But that just, I'm sharing that story as sort of an experience, as a story to kind of let you guys know, or so you kind of understand what it was like starting a life from the very bottom here. My mum and dad were both parents. My mum and dad were both my parents, and they were both teachers in Pakistan. So they did allow me to go to school, which was very, I'm pretty sure they cop a lot from the community for that. The fact that the only girl they had, and then my three brothers were all going to school, and they should really let me sit at home and take that money and invest it into my brother's future, because they will do something for them later on. Now, bless my brother's souls, they are doing stuff as well. But in our family, that difference between a girl and a boy didn't really exist. But when I went outside in the community, that was a whole different thing. When I went to school, I started realizing that as our year levels were going up, my girlfriends were dropping out of school, at a very, very fast rate as well. And then I'd come home and I wouldn't understand. And I would ask my mum and dad what's going on. Sometimes they would explain things to me properly. Sometimes they wouldn't really. But after a while, I did realize that, the reason behind them dropping out or not coming to school is because they have reached a certain age after which girls are not really, a decent girl or a respectful girl wouldn't really go to school. They'd rather stay at home, do housework, or get married, go raise children, do things like that. So, and I was doing the unspeakable stuff of going to school, making it to year 12, learning English, learning computer skills, all of that. So I'm glad they made the decision to come to Australia, because I don't know what would have happened to me if I was over there. One thing I know for sure is that the 12 years that I did spend at school would have been for nothing, because nobody told us that, oh, by the way, because you guys go to an Afghan school in an Afghan refugee town, nothing is registered. If you do want to continue your education, you basically have no qualification whatsoever. The only way out was that you would go back to Afghanistan and try and get your certificate qualified or registered over there. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. Sometimes I lost friends on the way to and back from Afghanistan. That's just how the reality was. So just very quickly about life here in Australia. As I mentioned before, things weren't easy, but things weren't also extremely difficult. We were fortunate to have a very supportive community around us. People, or maybe it was just, the nature of Australian community that we hadn't really experienced prior to that in our life at all. I do remember this one time my dad had gone to a supermarket. This was very early on, about a month or a month and a half after we had come to Australia. And he was just exploring, so he'd gone to a supermarket and he had bumped into somebody, and the guy turned around and said sorry to him. So he came home and he was really excited to tell us the story. He's like, you won't believe what happened. And we're like, what happened? What happened? And he goes, I went to the supermarket today. I bumped into this guy. He turned around and he said sorry to me. What an idiot. and I would look at him going, what? No, I don't get it. He's like, no, I bumped into him. He turned around. He said sorry to me. Like, it wasn't his fault. And he said sorry to me. And so I was like, oh, well, Dad, that's how things are here. Like, that's good manners. Like, people are polite. And then he just sat down and he thought, and he said that I actually don't remember the last time someone said sorry to me in my life at all. Like, I've lost family members. We've lost our country. People have come, invaded us. Like, we've become refugees, and all of this has happened, and no one has said sorry for that to me. And here I am bumping into this guy, and then he turns around and says sorry to me. So he does that every now and then now, just like, I don't know, it's his secret pleasure kind of thing that he every time he feels a little down, I don't know, he just goes and bumps into people and watches them say sorry. It's not a very good thing, but whatever helps him sleep at night, I suppose. But fast track 10 years down the lane to where I am right now. maybe because I've grown up and I know things better now, to me, the Australia that we came to less than 10 years ago is very different to what I see right now. The compassion and the sense of welcome, the sense of the acceptance that I received when I came with my entire family without any English background at all is not what we see today here. And I say that because through my work at Noor Foundation, where we actually go and help refugee and migrant families who have recently arrived with their very initial settlement, we see that every day. The fact that they need an interpreter, the fact that they can't communicate their problems themselves, I don't know, that wasn't a problem when we were here less than 10 years ago. And it really breaks my heart. And things that now are very different. And I really hope we get to talk about stuff like that today in this forum and try and come up with ways where we can actually change that, where everyone who comes to Australia has that positive experience that I had when I came and that I still try to look for so hard in our communities and try to, keep sending that message out that we are so much better than this. Thank you.
Thanks, Shabnam. That was really good. Our next speaker this afternoon is Vanessa Forrest. Vanessa is a humanitarian advisor for World Vision and has recently been focusing on issues surrounding funding for addressing the humanitarian crisis that is going on in Bangladesh concerning the Rohingya people. So could you please join me in welcoming Vanessa as she comes.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Shabnam, for sharing your story. I really appreciate that you've done that. And Shabnam's story really demonstrates the positive impact that we can have when someone moves from forced displacement to being safe and free in Australia. I just want to take a few minutes with you to step back and think about forced displacement globally. 1 in every 113 people on Earth is either forcibly displaced, a refugee, or an asylum seeker. At the end of 2016, when statistics were last generated, there were 65.6 million people who were forcibly displaced worldwide. About a third of these, 22.5 million, were refugees. That's nearly the population of Australia having been displaced from their own country. And almost double that, 40.3 million, were internally displaced within their own country. Additionally, 2.8 million people are registered as asylum seekers. Currently, less than 1% of these refugees and asylum seekers will ever be placed somewhere else. 84% of people also are seeking refuge in developing countries, countries unlike Australia. These are massive numbers, and it can be really hard to relate to. So let's take a step closer to our region, into Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, which is the fastest growing and densest refugee crisis in the world. Over 688,000 people have arrived since violence broke out in late August. 500,000 of these arrived in the first 2 months alone. These arrivals, as well as the existing refugee population and host communities, add up to 1.3 million people in need of assistance. People are residing in a series of hastily assembled, somewhat ad hoc camps. Now, camps are the last resort, and wherever possible, we make sure that sites are carefully planned and designed and ready for people to arrive. However, due to the scale and the immediacy in this instance, there was absolutely no time to do that. They're also designed to be a temporary solution. However, this is rarely the case, with the UN High Commission for Refugees quoting 17 years as the average length of stay that someone will have in a refugee camp. This is an exceptionally daunting prospect for a child, many of whom are either born into a camp or arrived so young that they know no other life. Every one of the 1.3 million people in Cox's Bazar has a story. And one of those stories is Humaira, who is a 24-year-old, now single mother of 3 young girls. Violence broke out in Humaira's village at 3 a.m, and in the chaos, she grabbed her children and fled. As she and her family were running, her husband was shot and killed. Humaira and her children left with only the clothes that they were wearing. They walked for days to reach Bangladesh. Their journey took many days, and for some refugees, this took up to 8 days to arrive. On arrival, her 1-year-old daughter, Shashira, was suffering from constant fever and cold. She also had lost a lot of weight in the journey and was suffering from diarrhoea for many days. Humaira visited a World Vision Women and Adolescent Centre and was provided with extra nutrition and also referred to a health clinic for specialised treatment. These centres are actually really integral to our response in Bangladesh. And in addition to ongoing nutrition interventions, they also provide women and children with support for psychological first aid, psychosocial support, and also provide referrals to clinics and services for gender-based violence. Spaces also provide and promote improved breastfeeding, including exclusive breastfeeding and adequate complementary feeding, and provide a safe space for women to breastfeed and receive counselling. So in a few short months ago, Humaira was living with her husband and her daughters in a village in Myanmar. Now she is a single mother in a congested refugee camp in Bangladesh, grieving the loss of her husband and trying to balance the roles of protector, provider, and primary caregiver for her 3 girls, with a very uncertain future. And children are disproportionately impacted by forced displacement. 55% of the refugees in Bangladesh are children. This compares to 31% globally. Stepping back for a moment, the scale of the crisis, the UN, I was looking for slides, but I'm not there. So the UN estimates that there will be about a $950 million requirement for Cox's Bazar in the next, from now until December. To give you a sense of the numbers that sit behind this, that's 12,200 metric tonnes of food per month and over 16 million litres of safe water a day for drinking, hygiene and sanitation. The Australian government has generously provided $31.5 million since August, and this is commendable. However, as we can see, there's a significant ongoing need in Bangladesh and also many other places around the world. Globally, there is a funding shortfall of $9 billion for humanitarian emergencies, and the shortfall is continuously increasing. 20 people every minute are forcibly displaced. That means in the brief time since I've stood up here, another 100 people have been forcibly displaced. Tim Costello, our Chief Advocate, will speak to you later this afternoon when he arrives about what more Australia can do around doing its fair share for the global issue of forced displacement. Thanks.
Thank you, Vanessa. It's quite a distressing situation, but definitely one to think about, and we'll continue to think about through this afternoon. Our next speaker is Pastor Rob Buckingham. Pastor Rob is Senior Minister here at Bayside Church and has first started Bayside about 26 years ago, which is strange given he just had his, 30th, 40th birthday the other week? That's what it was? So can you please welcome Pastor Rob as he comes.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jason. You're very kind. I want to address the question, what is a fair and just response to the current humanitarian crisis? Right now, as we've just heard, there are over 65 million forcibly displaced people worldwide. I want to state up front that I do not believe Australia can or should try to help all of these people. The refugee crisis is a worldwide problem that requires every nation to do what it can to help. I also believe that Australia has every right to protect its borders and to choose who does and does not settle in this country. We need to be vigilant in the face of terrorist threats and also have zero tolerance towards those who would threaten our safety as a society. We also need to prevent people from drowning as they attempt to reach Australia by boat. That being said, I believe that Australia also has a responsibility to act justly and compassionately towards those who find themselves in this country by whatever means. They are here. And so the question we need to ask is, how can we help them if they are indeed genuine asylum seekers? And that is my chief concern, as I have seen some absolutely appalling examples of harm rather than help inflicted on precious people over the last few years, people who have already experienced so much pain and distress and have reached out to us as a nation for help. Consider the family that attended our Bayside Church Christmas lunch a couple of years ago. A large South Sudanese family brought into Dandenong and given temporary accommodation at a motel. There was a TV in the room that they were given, but they were given no food and no help. If it weren't for our church, they would have gone hungry for many days. Recently, we've read about a Sri Lankan family from Queensland, which was taken by force from their home at 5 a.m. on Monday, the 12th of March. Given 5 minutes to collect a few belongings, the family, including two daughters, one aged 2, the other aged just 7 months, were taken to a Melbourne detention centre. They were then relocated to a Perth detention centre, and I believe they are still there. The family is separated in detention. The 2 girls, both born in Australia, are locked away from their parents for 23 hours a day, with only 1 hour of reunification each day with mum and dad. What a cruel way to treat a toddler and a baby. That is not justice. Then consider the young woman who is a Christian convert from Islam. I'll refer to her as Esther. She fled her native Iran because it is illegal and dangerous there to convert from Islam. According to a report from the New York-based Center for Human Rights in Iran, Iranian authorities are increasingly cracking down on Christian converts in the country, arresting and imprisoning believers in their attempts to suppress Christianity. Esther arrived in Australia by boat and spent approximately 2 years in detention, where she experienced dreadful treatment, including rape. For the last couple of years, she's lived in Melbourne under a temporary protection visa. During interviews with the Immigration Department, Esther was asked 3 times by her caseworker to recite the Muslim prayers. First, she was asked, "Can you?" To which Esther replied, "Yes, but I don't want to." The caseworker then said, "I would like you to." Esther said, "I can, but I don't believe in that anymore. I believe it's against my Christian faith." The caseworker then said these words, "I don't believe that you can recite the Muslim prayers, and I don't believe you've been raised as a strict Muslim." Under this kind of pressure, Esther finally agreed. The caseworker told Esther to get down on her knees and to go through the prescribed actions while she recited the prayers. Esther complied, but the caseworker finally said, "Okay, now I believe that you were raised a Muslim." An older man we know, also from Iran, arrived by boat in Australia in 2013 and spent approximately 2 years in detention. I'll refer to him as Hotham. Hotham is a responsible, hard-working man. He's working in Australia, paying taxes, learning English and our Australian culture, and he's not breaking the law. Like Esther, Hotham is a Christian convert from Islam. He was led to faith in Jesus several years ago and mentored by an Assyrian Christian in Iran. The Assyrian man has been asked, even recently, to write a letter to confirm the genuineness of Hotham's faith. But he is fearful to do this, as his life would be threatened by the Iranian authorities if he were found out. Without this proof, however, the Australian Immigration Department won't issue a visa to Hotham, and now he risks being arrested at any moment and returned to detention. He told me recently that he would rather die. Compare these situations with that of a young Malay man who recently arrived in Australia by plane on a tourist visa. Before his tourist visa expired, he lodged a claim for protection because, as a Muslim from Malaysia, he'd got into trouble with the Malaysian authorities for having sex with several women, something strictly forbidden under Islamic law in Malaysia. This young man was also a member of a gang and had been involved in fights with weapons and had his life threatened in Malaysia because he was accused of raping the sister of an opposing gang member. He has applied for protection in Australia, and it looks like he has a very strong case to receive it. As a legal, and I put in inverted commas, plain arrival, he also has the right of appeal through the Australian Administrative Tribunal, something that is not available to people like Esther and Hotham, who arrive by boat, even though it is not illegal to arrive by boat in Australia. I ask you, is this young Malay man the sort of person you want living in Australia while Esther, Hotham, the Sri Lankan family and hundreds like them risk being held in deplorable conditions in Australian detention centres? My Christian faith compels me to speak and act for those who are oppressed and powerless. The prophet Isaiah wrote these words about 3,000 years ago. Learn to do right, seek justice, defend the oppressed, take up the cause of the fatherless, plead the case of the widow. God requires people to administer true justice, show mercy and compassion to one another. The Australian government is not exempt from these responsibilities. Just this week, we've heard of a 10-year-old refugee boy who has made repeated attempts to kill himself while held on Nauru, being ordered to move to Australia for acute psychological care, with a judge saying the boy would be at imminent risk of dying if left in the regional processing centre. The Home Affairs Department fought the injunction, arguing that there was sufficient healthcare on the island to treat the boy and asking the court to delay the court hearing by 1 week. Justice Nye Perham disagreed and ordered that the boy be immediately returned to Australia for treatment, and stating, and I quote, "A delay cannot be justified. There is significant risk the boy would not be alive by that hearing, and I am not prepared to run that risk." One can only wonder what a 10-year-old boy has already suffered in his short life to cause him to be suicidal. Already he's tried to end his life by overdosing on drugs, strangling himself, and trying to cut himself with a paring knife. The judge ruled that Australia held a duty of care to the boy and his family. I agree. But why would the Home Affairs Department fight this in court? Wasting this sort of money and time has only further damaged this young boy, as well as Australia's reputation as a civilised country that is often failing to administer true justice or show mercy and compassion to others. Something has to change. Thank you.
Thank you, Pastor Rob. Our next speaker this afternoon is the member for Hotham, Miss Clare O'Neill. Clare was elected to the Federal Parliament in 2013, so she's now into her second term, I believe. Clare holds a Bachelor of Arts and Law from Monash University, as well as a Master's in Public Policy from Harvard. She was the mayor for the great city of Greater Dandenong in 2004, and I'm sure her insights will be greatly valued. Welcome also to Tim Costello. So would you welcome Clare as she comes?
Thank you so much, Jason. And I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today. And I want to acknowledge Pastors Rob and Christy for having us today. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to speak with you. I'm seeing some familiar faces in the audience, and there's quite a number of you that have come to see me on these subjects before, and I really want to honestly say how grateful I am that you're bringing these to the attention of politicians and trying to keep them at the top of the political agenda where I believe that they belong. I want to start today by talking about values, because it's Palm Sunday and the issues that we're talking about today are really about who we are as a country and how we define ourselves and what our role is and what our responsibilities are to others. I got involved in politics when I was really young. I joined the Labor Party when I was 16, and the reason I did that is a core belief about my life that drives me today still as a public representative. And that is that to be born in Australia, to be born in a loving home as I was, in a household where my parents did everything to try to give me educational opportunities, I am one of the luckiest people in the world. Statistically, I am. In fact, just by virtue of all of us being in this room, we won a winning Tats Lotto ticket. And I am very conscious that I didn't do anything to deserve those opportunities. I don't have a moral claim over them. And so the fundamental guiding principle of my life is that I have to use those opportunities to serve and to try to create opportunities for others. So that's what drives me in politics, but I also make that observation about us as a country. Australia is something like the 10th richest country in the world. We're in a region where the average person being born in Australia has wildly a more prosperous life, better health outcomes, a longer life than the average person who's born in Indonesia, in Myanmar, in Laos, in Cambodia. So we've got some big obligations. One of the topics that we wanted to touch on today is about foreign aid, and I see that as a really clear expression of those obligations that we have to people within our region and around the world more generally. The first thing I want to say about foreign aid is that we know this works. The very best evidence that we have from people who are economists and other specialists who spend every day looking at these subjects have reached a almost consensus view that foreign aid saves millions and millions of lives, and it has done for the previous sort of years that we've been trying to seriously tackle this problem. I think one of the best examples we see is in the area of vaccinations and human health outcomes. In 1970, we had a 5% global vaccination rate. Today, it's 70%. And we're seeing diseases like polio that, for the older people in this room might remember, ravaged Australians many years ago, on the brink of extinction, effectively, because of these things. Those programs have mainly been the result of foreign aid. We heard an amazing story here about this young woman being educated in Afghanistan, where she was born. About 10 years ago, there were basically no girls who were getting the opportunity to go to school because of aid funding, because of the work of the Afghan government in conjunction with aid partners. There are 3.5 million Afghan girls in school today, and that's happened over a decade. Now, that is amazing. So we know that aid changes lives, and we're a big, rich country, and so we have to be in there and we have to be doing more. And I can say I'm proud of some of the things that the party I'm in has done. We set a target to try to reach 0.5% of our GNI is the metric that we usually use. That's probably wasn't enough. I'm in there trying to advocate for us to be spending more. But I'm proud of some of the things that Labor's been able to achieve while it's been in office on foreign aid, but we're not doing enough. And unfortunately, those numbers have come right off because of decisions that have been made by the current government. And I'm really disappointed to see that. And I think we'll see a different situation emerge if Labor does get elected at some stage down the track. So foreign aid, it's really important. I want us to be doing more. I want to say something about refugees. I'm really deeply disturbed by some of the stories that you've told there, Pastor, really disturbed. And when I think about refugees, I'm thinking more about the 65 million displaced people who are mainly living overseas. But what you're really talking about here is a cultural issue and an attitude issue in how we're dealing with refugees domestically. And I'm really concerned about some of the things that you've raised. On refugees, again, we clearly are not meeting our obligations to the world. 26 million people, there is effectively an infinite desire for people around the world to come to Australia, so we have to somehow decide how many people are going to be allowed to settle here and where we're going to take those people from. But we could be doing more. I absolutely believe that. So again, I'm advocating fiercely for us to be doing that in Canberra. And at the last election, my political party put forward a policy that we double our overall refugee intake. That may still be not enough. I'm sure there's people in this room who would like us to be doing more. But I think there is more that can be done. And I'm hopeful that, again, if Labor is to take government, that we will see a change in what's happening there in terms of our numbers. I think what is happening in Manus Island and Nauru at the moment is awful. It's absolutely terrible. And I met with a refugee advocate just at the end of last week who was talking to me about the fact that these people, who some of whom have been in detention for more than 5 years now, committed no crime. No one claims that they've committed a crime as far as I'm aware. These people are starting to see extraordinary deterioration in their health. Their mental health for sure, but actually just their physical health. People who were very well, who were in the prime of their life in their 20s 5 years ago, who are now starting to contract strange diseases. There is something that is actually rotten to the core in how we are dealing with that situation there, and getting those men, women and children out of detention in Manus Island it has to be a priority for us. So that's a couple of the issues that I know are of interest to you. I want to share, though, just in finishing, one final thought. There is a bit of a difference about how I probably thought about these problems before I was a Member of Parliament and how I think about them now. There are some additional things that Tim and I need to think about when we're considering these obligations, and I want to share those with you just so we can have a richer conversation. I think the first one is that Australia isn't all-powerful in how it deals with the rest of the world. And I think if I was not a Member of Parliament right now and I was reading about what's happening in Myanmar, which is devastating. It is a human rights catastrophe, what is happening in Myanmar at the moment. And I think I'd be sitting in my living room just feeling really angry and saying, like, why isn't the Australian government doing something about this? But because I'm a Member of Parliament, I have to get down to the practicalities of what exactly we would do. So we say things publicly. I think probably the Australian government could say more, but certainly I'm aware of conversations that have happened between Aung San Suu Kyi and the Prime Minister when she was in Australia recently. But we just don't have, in terms of a global world order, we don't have a system that accommodates human rights tragedies like this very easily. And so I just ask, in your thinking about this, try to think about the specifics. What is it that you want us to do about this problem that's not being done at the moment? And the second thing is just about the idea of having constrained resources. So foreign aid, we do need to do more. I believe that. Labor will do more. We've committed to that. But just remember that every dollar the Australian government spends has to come from somewhere else. So in politics, we face the difficult question of not just what are all the good ideas, we'll just do them, but of those good ideas, which are the ones that kind of leap that bar to being a priority. So in thinking about foreign aid, I think there's lots of things that we could forego in order to fulfil our responsibilities globally. And I don't want to get into the politics, but there's some big ticket items under current debate in Australia that the Australian government's pressing ahead with that I think are probably not right to prioritise, like the company tax cut, in an environment where we've got a lot of people living in poverty here in Australia and a lot of people around the world who really need Australia's support and assistance. So I might leave it there, and thanks for having me. Really looking forward to your questions and discussion.
Thank you, Claire. Next, we have the member for Goldstein, Mr. Tim Wilson. Tim was elected in 2016, so just at the recent election. He holds a Bachelor of Arts majoring in Policy Studies and a Master's in Diplomacy and Trade, which we'll see if that makes its way to being relevant or super relevant at some point. So if you could welcome Tim as he comes.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. And well, the truth actually is on diplomacy is that a lot of people think it means saying a lot and being very polite. In fact, diplomacy is about outcomes and actually about improving outcomes for people, the lives and nations. But before we get into that and how that materialises to the current discussion, I'd also like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land in which we meet and pay respect to their elders past and present. And also to thank particularly World Vision for bringing this together with Bayside Church. And Tim, I know you're here now, so we can say nice things about you to your face. But we can also say nice things to Rob and Christy in particular for their leadership of this church. And I really want to hit on one key point that Rob mentioned. And all of the human stories you told were incredibly powerful, and we've spoken about them many times before, and I've no doubt again. The importance of a discussion around justice. And this is something I've been on about for a while. I think the absence of a discussion around what justice means in liberal democracies all around the world today is one of the most critical gaps in our public dialogue. And I think it's extremely damaging. I think over the past 20 to 30 years, and I'm a free market person, we've got into a very rational discussion around public policy, mostly using numbers. And we've foregone an intellectual maturity around what justice means. And being somebody who comes from a liberal, and I don't mean partisan, I mean philosophical perspective, liberalism was founded not just on ideas about economics, but on ideas about what justice means within a society, and the sense of moral obligation you have to those less well off, the things that Clare was talking about. And I think that the whole of political class, by and large, has let that go, and it's had led to some aberrations, but I won't go into those matters. For the most part, I actually agree with just about everything every other member of the panel has said, in different hues and focuses. But I think what I can add is probably a different dimension, particularly following on from Clare, about an honest assessment about where these challenges lie, particularly around foreign aid and around asylum seekers and refugees, and the role of the Australian government and Australia as a nation. And I do this both as a Member of Parliament, but having served as Australia's Human Rights Commissioner, working with getting children out of detention, having visited onshore detention centres, been to refugee camps around the world. There's no dispute that the situation we're facing now around the world is more challenging than ever has been before. We know that foreign aid, yes, can do an enormous amount to improve people's lives. It plays a different role at different times between dealing with immediate crises related to the environment or to do with political events or military events, but also in its long-term capacity to build nations. And one of the most challenging things that's actually happening, if we're having an honest conversation about aid at the moment, is that aid is shifting from a discussion after a period after the end of the Cold War, where it was mostly focused on improving people's lives and improving people's standard of living and economic opportunity, to getting to the heart of geopolitical positioning, particularly when we're talking about the sphere of influence that we have around Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. Earlier this year, the Assistant Minister for Pacific Affairs, Connie Fierravanti-Wells, how should we say, had a moment where she made a series of outbursts against China. But critically sitting behind her comments was a frustration that now is emerging, where other countries are using their foreign aid programs to strategically position themselves with their influence in the region to secure resources, and not just in the Pacific Islands and Southeast Asia. And that one of the great challenges that we all have is we believe in Australia playing a foreign aid program. Everyone will have a different view about what quantum it should be. But the extent to which we then have to use that foreign aid program to secure the interests of those countries to be free and independent, to not buckle under international pressure, particularly from some other nations, and ultimately which translates then through to our own domestic security as well. And these are the sorts of things that governments, whether Liberal or Labor, are going to be forced to confront. Last year, I spent some time in the Zatari refugee camp and in Lebanon and Jordan, and some of the challenges we face around our foreign aid program there, helping refugees, of course, but also recognising that there are millions of people who have been displaced from the Syrian conflict and continue to be displaced from the Syrian conflict and have been there in those refugee camps now in excess of, certainly in many cases, 5 and in some cases up to 8 to 10 years. And the challenge that those people face on a day-to-day basis, as well as the challenge we face as an international community about rebuilding a nation that has been torn apart by conflict, and that our interests are not to leave a vacuum, and that while we want to help and assist people, we also have to want countries and people to reunite and rebuild, because what happens in the gap and happens in a vacuum when you don't have people who return to their country is that people who want to use it for ill-gotten gains may fill that vacuum and do terrible things as well. Particularly, of course, associated with those wanting to radicalise people, and that obviously has a direct effect on the people who live in those countries, but also for countries like our own. The similar challenge has existed in the space of refugees, and I mean, I'm a great believer that bureaucracies are designed for our people, they're never designed for people. And that's where you get some of those terrible stories we've heard already. And to go right back to the start, behind every single refugee story is a human story, a story of struggle, a story of difficulty and, depending on the circumstances, displacement, persecution, and we should never lose sight of that. And bureaucracy should never lose sight of that as well. But our great challenge as a government, as a nation, has been to rebuild a sense of confidence in how our refugee program has worked over many years. And because the reality, and not to seek to get involved in the partisanship of this debate, but particularly when we came to government in 2013 before I was elected, the public confidence around the refugee program was lower than it is today. And how to do that, and our great challenge is how to rebuild that confidence, but then to inject humanitarian discussion as part of that. Because once you build a sense of order and confidence, the humanity returns to the conversation where we must have it. And that is very strongly my view. But of course, none of this is straightforward. It's about making sure that we do continue to accept people. It means that we provide proper pathways for people who come to Australia to then be able to integrate into our country. It's to make sure that we have people who are able to live full lives. And none of that is straightforward. Our compassion leads us rightly, whether it's based on faith or values or our own personal humanity, to want to see an enlarged space of growth for people to be able to integrate and be successful in our nation as part of our refugee program. But we can't ever lose sight of the practical nature of it. And so I call again to Clare's point, which is the great challenge for all of us is what we can do practically. And it's not just about a government and what it can do practically. It's about what we as individuals can do on a practical level as well. And I know there are lots of people in the room here who are activists or advocates or have taken refugees or are refugees or have taken refugees or assisted with other refugees to be part of that solution. So we have different ways we can look at it. We can look at it as a point of conflict, or we can look at it as part of a journey that we take forward together. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. And now from one Tim, we move to another. Our next speaker is Tim Costello. Tim is the Chief Advocate of World Vision. Before that, he was CEO of World Vision for 13 years. Could you welcome Tim?
Well, given it's a church setting, I'll make it easier. I'm 1 Timothy, he's 2 Timothy. Sorry for being late. I've been at the Palm Sunday rally and reminded them that when I spoke that Palm Sunday seemed to be a euphoric success. What followed the week following was not. Betrayal by a friend, wrongful arrest, farce of a trial, false imprisonment, torture, and a crucifixion. What followed actually goes right to the very heart of what some of the refugee stories that we've heard, hopefully not with crucifixion, but some we know if they're sent back, maybe crucifixion, what is terrifying. I want to acknowledge the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation. I want to thank you for coming out tonight, this afternoon. I do not take that for granted. To give up part of your time, all we have in life is time. When someone wastes our time, they're a thief. We only have time to come out on a Sunday afternoon for what is quite a heavy, morally serious topic. I want to thank you for being here. I want to thank Pastor Rob and Christy, my favourite pastors. Their passion from Indonesia and Bali and visiting incarcerated people to all around the world reminds me that, I'm troubled as a Christian, mainly about Matthew 25. We've been told how we're going to be judged. We've been given the exam questions in advance. Did you visit those in prison? Did you feed the hungry? Did you clothe the naked? When you did this to the least of these. That's actually the scripture that troubles me the most about an account of my life. But to these pastors who lead this church in that way, I want to thank you. To all the others who have spoken and to our 2 federal members of Parliament, thank you so much for being here. And of course to Jason Kelly, volunteering in the organising as well as emceeing, and to also staff at World Vision, whose new campaign, Safe and Free, is really focusing on refugees. Look, having just spoken at the Palm Sunday rally, let me say that one of the things that moves me is the fact that 84% of the world's refugees are in the poorest nations. That's where they are. We have a generous resettlement program, but there's only about 10 nations that do that, so we like to say how good we are on that, but it's not comparing apples with apples in terms of who actually carries the burdens. The burden of the poorest nations, and I've been to most of them, is extraordinary, and the response is extraordinary, and it just gives us perspective when we think in Australia about boasting about being generous in a small resettlement program. The truth is that we aren't a world leader. The world leaders are Uganda, Ethiopia, Jordan, Kenya, Lebanon, Uganda, Bangladesh. They're the ones who have most of the refugee program. When we look at our generosity, it's pretty simple to compare. When we look at all that we do compared to other nations, well, we come in about 48th on gross national income or GDP in terms of generosity. We aren't up there, 10th in the world richest, on some reckonings, 3rd per capita in the world, richest in the world, down at number 48. So, perspective is important. Secondly, the generosity of these poor nations never ceases to move me. I was in South Sudan and northern Uganda in January. I'm back there in May. 2.5 million South Sudanese have fled ethnic violence. It's horrifying. Parents literally saying to kids, follow the neighbours, follow the column of suffering humanity. Kids who arrive in northern Uganda where we register them and feed them, who have no idea if their parents are dead or alive, who have no idea where they are. They've walked often for a week without food, with a little bit of water and tattered clothes, literally with the only things they own, the clothes on their back. Many of these we then put into foster families because they aren't probably ever going to see their parents again in northern Uganda. What amazes me is 1 million South Sudanese have fled into northern Uganda in the last year, and they haven't closed the border. The Ugandan government, working with us and other agencies, registers these refugees, then gives them 30 by 30 metres of land, spare land, not great land, but spare land in northern Uganda, government land. World Vision gives them tools to start a vegetable garden and to put up a house. The Ugandan government says these refugees can go to Ugandan schools. They can go and use Ugandan health clinics, poor and overwhelmed as they are. They have all the rights of a Ugandan citizen except the right to vote. And when I ask the Ugandan authorities why they haven't closed the border, I think what our nation would do, they say, because once we were refugees under Idi Amin. It really hits me, this profound defining feature of what it means to be human, to have empathy. To say we can't do everything, but to have empathy. What if that was me? I fear ever a tyrannical government in this country, and we're fleeing. I'm not sure who's going to take us. Well, in the refugee camps around the world that I've been to, I see extraordinary burden sharing. And World Vision's proposition on refugees is pretty simple. Let's not give ourselves a leave pass and say someone else's problem because we got this great historical accident to be the only nation continent on earth, off Broadway, surrounded by sea, a long way away from where the problems are. Let's actually be genuine, because this is who Aussies are, rolling up their sleeves, showing empathy about doing our fair share. World Vision calculates that at a refugee intake of about 42,000 refugees. Now, Tim was referring to the juggling of immigration quotas. Yep, I know. And when I'm stuck in traffic, I'm tempted to blame immigrants too and say we've got too many. No, you didn't. No, I'm not saying you said that, but I'm saying that's an attitude that's out there. I'm tempted to do that. The truth is, we often cherry pick our immigrants. Other nations, poor nations, have paid for their university degree. We've actually taken their best, and yes, they're going to make great Australian citizens. We can reduce, the big Australia debate's on, if it's warranted, I'm not buying into the argument, our overall intake, if that's warranted. But we can still actually have, in our view, 42,000 who are on a humanitarian visa. We still can share the load without it becoming far too many or being tied up with refugees, maybe they're terrorists, which is the blurring that really does damage in the public mind. To actually be really clear about this. When it comes to thinking about aid, we know that all the global challenges can only be addressed on a multilateral, that is an international cooperative basis. Whether it's climate change or displacement or famine, the world is a waterbed. You press down here, it comes up here. Of course, the international rules system in the UN depends still totally on national sovereignty to run it. We've been thinking about a permanent member of the Security Council we now all suspect used toxins to kill an ex-spy on British soil. Now, if a permanent member of the Security Council will not obey the rules, you actually see how difficult it is with national sovereignty to honour international rules. Nonetheless, Australia, of all nations, a middle nation, needs to be at the forefront of advocating those international rules. Whether it's trade, we're a trading nation. Whether it's dealing with climate change, we can't pull up the drawbridge and say the forests in Indonesia or Brazil aren't our worry, we're an island nation. We have to be at the forefront of those international rules, including refugees, the UN Convention on Refugees, and certainly including aid. Aid isn't the silver bullet to dealing with poverty. Trade and aid run together. But aid has been unbelievably successful, even in landlocked nations with no resources, with pretty ugly neighbours, reducing maternal deaths and infant deaths, vaccinations, which Clare spoke about. Aid has seen, in my time, when I started at World Vision 15 years ago, the number of kids under 5 dying from dirty water, malaria, pneumococcal disease, reduced from 30,000 kids under the age of 5 to today, it will be 16,000 kids dying. Aid works. It literally saves lives. And sometimes I hear Australians give themselves a leave pass and say, yeah, but Asians and Africans, they're used to death. Let me tell you, an African and an Asian mother grieves the loss of a child as much as an Australian mother. There's no leave pass here. There's no leave pass to block off our empathy, to actually call for what our response should be. When we see how aid works, and Tim and Clare, who've done some of the Gates-funded trips, have been to these camps, there's no problem at all with my view of their compassion and their empathy. They have seen what it does. One example of how aid works, we in 2015, before the earthquake in Nepal, World Vision retrofitted 160 Nepalese schools. Every single one of them survived the 7.8 magnitude earthquake. Some 6,000 Nepalese schools were severely damaged or destroyed. Aid works. It saves lives. It gives parents, and your parents, and I'm a parent, we all know the moral panic of protecting our kids. If you don't, you've failed as a parent. You feel a failure. Aid stems that moral panic of terrible failure for parents. again and again. It's why we believe that the call for the Australian government to have a target to lift aid from its historical low level, the lowest level ever in our history, 22 cents of gross national income to 33 cents, is appropriate. It saves lives, it works, it gives hope. And I think it's really important to, again, have perspective when we say, oh, well, can we afford that? Well, the British government has far higher public debt, government to debt, than us, about 80%. We're at about 20%, I think. They've legislated 0.7%, 70 cents in $100. David Cameron, a Conservative Prime Minister, said, we will not balance the books on the backs of the poor. Now, that's leadership. The Scandinavian countries have kept their promise. The Dutch have kept their promise. We who live closest to most of the world's poor seem to have said no debt, oh, it's too big. Well, that's Australians actually being disconnected from who we really are, what we can do. I find it very distressing when I hear two things. One thing is, oh, well, aid only goes in corruption. Well, we've got the figures. The level of Australian aid lost in corruption, which is so tiny, is much less than our employment programs here in Australia as a percentage. It is tiny. The second excuse I always hear is, well, we've got homeless here, Indigenous poverty. Well, Vision's working on Indigenous poverty. I've spent 20 years of my life running domestic charities with homeless, mentally ill, drug affected, first in St Kilda, then Urban Seed in Collins Street. What really upsets me with let's just look after our own, charity begins at home, is this. We love to actually set our poor off against those in absolute poverty overseas. We don't set our poor off against defence spending or superannuation concessions. We actually try and set it off against the poor. This is not who we are. People in absolute poverty need to be dealt with, and our own poor. This is not an option and a choice between one or the other. I often find those who say, let's just look after our own, Tim, charity begins at home. When I start asking a few questions, almost invariably, I discover the person who says that is actually doing very little at home. Very little at home. Empathy, whether it's here or beyond, is the same empathy. It understands, it imagines. And whilst I've mentioned defence, it's interesting that in the Australian budget, I've never understood this why. Our members might explain why to me. We don't have a budget figure for health or education or what it should be. There's only two parts of the budget that have ever had percentages attached. 2% for defence and 0.7%, that's our international promise, for aid. For some reason, I don't know the history, they have always been the signpost to which we actually sign up for. Let me say, on defence, don't quibble with that at all. But here's my problem. There's always money for defence. Tim's been to Azatari and seen the camps out of Syria. You know, the Syrian war couldn't have gone on for more than 12 months without the great powers, Iran and Russia on Assad's side, Saudi Arabia, America, Australia on the side of, well, we thought they were moderates. They weren't always moderates. It couldn't have gone on for 12 months without the great powers funding them with defence and armaments and money. It couldn't have gone on. Both sides had the illusion their side could win when it was a stalemate almost certainly within the first 6 to 12 months. We keep saying always money for defence and guns. It's why I don't mind if there's jobs in Adelaide for our 50 billion on subs, but when our aim becomes let's, and it's now been made explicit, lift Australia out of being in only the 20th in arms exporter to being in the top 10, I go, why is there always money for defence? And yet we've cut aid to our lowest level. I say that because the 3 Ds, Tim talked about geopolitics, and he's right. The 3 Ds are diplomacy, Tim mentioned that, defence, and development. That D, development, has been massively short-shrifted. It affects our businesses. When we cut aid in our region, the Chinese aren't cutting it, the British aren't cutting it. Do you think it's an Australian company or a Chinese or British company that gets the contract? They remember. It's just, at every level, silly to do. So really I want to conclude by saying I hope you'll sign on for our Safe and Free campaign. There's folders at registration. I do want the narrative of who we are and how we empathise and how we respond in our giving in the Australian aid program to change. I do thank the members for being here, and I thank you for being here also.
Thank you, Tim. We now come to the second part of this afternoon's forum, which is the Q&A session, where you get the chance to have your say and to ask a question of members of our panel. Just before we get there, I'd just like to provide one caution, which is that I would appreciate it if you'd be able to keep your contributions short and respectful, and also mindful that what our speakers said is what they meant. They didn't mean other things. We shouldn't be putting words in their mouth. We should be mindful of their views that they've considered over a long period of time. So are there any questions? We have a couple of roving mics we'll be able to get to. Just up the back there. Keep your hand up just for a moment while we get a mic to you. We'll just be a second.
Hi, I just wanted to ask a question to Tim. So given the resistance in the Liberal Party to same-sex marriage, and we've sort of seen, obviously, that has shifted and it's led to a big success late last year, do you think it's possible to create a similar cultural change in the Liberal Party to have more compassionate, humanitarian and just policies towards refugees, both referring to people who are on Manus and Nauru and also in reference to aid policies that we've talked about?
So I'm going to start, I'm very honest, or I try and be as honest as I can, which is I don't completely accept the premise of the question, because I don't believe that people like myself or others within the Liberal Party aren't compassionate about refugees. It comes back to the component of balancing out the competing objectives, and every political party will have different positions. But do I think that once we've got to a point where there's more humanity in the dialogue and the discussion, that there can be a shift towards improving that understanding and certainly perception? I think resolutely yes. I think a critical part of it has to be about taking people on a journey. Well, one of the worst things that's developed in our modern politics is people's preparedness to hector others in judgment because they don't agree with people, rather than recognising that the great task of being persuaded is to recognise and accept where people are and take them on a journey to where you want them to be. And that can sometimes be explicit because people literally go on a physical journey, but sometimes it can be about going through a much better process of understanding and listening to what their concerns are so that you can unpack it and address them. And the truth was, because you raised it, on the postal survey was an example of people being taken on a journey, because I can tell you there were some people in the community as well as in Parliament who believed that the postal survey was going to deliver a negative response, and people like me who almost perfectly predicted the outcome. But it was them going through that took them on that journey.
Who was next?
Australia has recently recommitted to training and supporting the Myanmar military. Can our members on the panel please comment on whether you think that this is justified, considering the human rights abuses that have occurred against the Rohingya population? Isn't this giving a message to the Myanmar government that Australia is condoning what's happening there?
Tim Wilson.
Thank you.
Sure, I was trying to be charitable and make sure that at least Claire didn't feel I was grabbing the microphone. The truth is, in every geopolitical relationship, there are many messages that can be sent based on what you do and how you cooperate with countries. I'm nervous about... So one of the things I was actually going to do is go and speak to the Foreign Minister about this week, but we're going back to Parliament this week, so an opportunity to have a dialogue. So I'm nervous about saying something too strident in light of the situation. I think everybody's cognizant of what is happening in Myanmar. Nobody's trying to pretend otherwise, and particularly from where that country has come from and what could have been a spring of hope to where it has descended very quickly shows the complications that sit below it. But of course, there are regional considerations beyond it. So I'm not going to say something as strident as saying that the decision of the government turns a blind eye or endorses these human rights atrocities. I don't think that's the case, and I suspect Clare probably wouldn't either, because these are the sorts of decisions that governments have to make. But the question for us, and this is why I always say I focus on outcomes, is how are we more effective in working with those governments to hold account and to reshape their policies to send it in a better direction. I'm not convinced that chest thumping will necessarily be effective in changing those governments' behaviours or policies. Now, that's a very realpolitik worldview. That won't earn me any applause, but I've seen many times in other policy areas where governments actually use foreign criticism as the basis for justification of their domestic conduct. And that's happened particularly in some very egregious examples in parts of East Africa, and I've no doubt it occurs in many other places where I'm less familiar.
Thanks, Tim, and thanks for your question. I'm just going to do something that's highly unusual for a politician and say I don't feel I have the expertise to really answer your question. I'm not sure what specifically the Australian government is training Myanmar military in, if that is indeed what's happening, and I'll leave it to Tim to talk to Julie Bishop about that. I'm a bit separated from that because it's happening on the other side of politics, and I say that not to be political, only the reality is Julie Bishop doesn't pick up the phone often when I call her, so no, I'm just kidding. But if I could just say something, I just nuance a little bit some of the things that Tim's talked about. Sometimes in the public, I think there's a lot of pressure for Australian governments to effectively cut off their engagement with foreign governments when we don't like what they're doing. And to be completely clear, I'm sure I speak, for everyone in the room and for all sides of politics when I say what is going on in Myanmar is utterly unacceptable, and the violence there is gruesome and horrible. And we need to be doing what we can to stop it. But I know, Aung San Suu Kyi was here when the ASEAN leaders came in the middle of March. There were other foreign leaders of countries in ASEAN who have got pretty bad human rights records. And so there's always pressure to say, don't invite them, don't let them come to Australia, we need to cut off contact and that sort of thing. And I really feel strongly that's the wrong approach for us to take, because we just lose our power to influence them. So it's not, it's not the sort of engagement that you have with your family and friends where you might take a different approach as individuals, but when it comes to nations dealing with one another, I think it's generally not helpful to disengage. But with the specifics of your question about military engagement, I can't comment on that, so we'll look forward to hearing back from what Tim finds out.
I might, I don't know if that's working, just add a comment. Having been to Cox's Bazaar, what overwhelmed me was the number of women who'd been raped, seen their husbands murdered, villages burnt. You just could not believe that human malevolence and cruelty could be at that level. And we now all know, and this is the coded language that Tim and Clare are using, that this has been, if not state-ordered, certainly state-sanctioned. And the most dangerous place in life is when your own state turns against you. The power of the state is terrifying. And on the Myanmar military, it seems to me that that's where the diplomacy has to be worked out with Julie Bishop as to how we engage and what messages we engage on and terms, because that engagement is going on. But it's where aid and humanitarian refugee intake are important. It's where the other levers I was talking about, because we cut, when our aid program was slashed roughly 11 billion over 4 years in the Abbott hockey budget, Myanmar was cut by 40%. That actually gives us less leverage, whether we like it or not. That's where development is actually part of it. On refugee policy, I think we can send messages while still engaging with the military. And the refugee policies is we are taking Rohingya because we know they are being persecuted by the state. Tim won't mind me saying, maybe he will. I've got the car engine running anyway, so here goes. Before Peter Dutton takes a white South African farmer, and the violence there is terrible, but there's not evidence that the state is persecuting white African farmers until I see that. Take the Rohingya on Manus that I met up there last November. Bring them here because we know the state is actually persecuting them. Our policy should be non-discriminatory. Doesn't matter if you're white or brown, what your religion is. It should be utterly non-discriminatory. But that would be our message, even if we choose to that refugee intake, our message, even if we choose to keep engaging with the Myanmar military.
Did you want to respond to that, Mr. Wilson? Anything that Tim Costello said just then?
We can get into a long debate about different countries and what we're going to do. I'll leave.
Yep, that's fine. Next question, Pastor Christie.
I'd like to say that I am so grateful that I am not doing the job of Tim or Clare. I find it difficult enough with leading a community and making decisions on practicalities that you just have to make. And you mentioned that, Tim, about the practicalities and also, Clare, how you see things differently being in government. My question is, and I hear this a lot when I'm out and about, and this is a perception, and I don't know if there's a place for discussion for this or where that place is, but I hear a lot of people saying it ought not to be only a government decision on what happens. There is a community that also wants to help, that wants to embrace, and why can't this be our problem? Not our problem, that's probably the wrong word, but why can't we solve this together? And I know that the Pope has, said he's asked parishes to take in refugees. Other spiritual leaders have asked for that. I've talked to people in NGOs and all sorts of environments where they've said, how can we actually, where is the place for our voice to say, we want to be part of the solution. Together, let's have this conversation. Together, let's go on the journey so that it's not this chest-thumping thing.
Thanks, Christy, and thanks for your kind words. And I'm going to run a campaign for you to run for Parliament because I think it'd be amazing. Just don't run against me, please.
Never.
No, I know. Oh, right, okay, yeah. I think I'd really struggle running against you, Christy. No, I think you'd be fantastic. So what a brilliant idea. And, the work that you and Rob and your community are doing here, there's no more kind of pure expression of Christian values than to take in refugees and to advocate for them and protect them in the way that you're doing. So I'm so respectful of that. It's interesting just hearing about what you said, Shabnam, about how the tone of the treatment of refugees has really changed over the last decade. And I'm really disturbed to hear people say that, and there seems to be a lot of recognition in the audience, because I don't think that expresses what Australians actually feel about refugees. And all the evidence in the past showed us that, people, the majority of Australians don't like people arriving by boat. There's some people that don't mind it at all, but the majority of people don't like people arriving by boat. That shouldn't drive our public policy, but I'm just noting it as a public perception. But there is enormous support for our refugee program here in Australia. And, I have this great privilege of representing Springvale, South Keysborough, some of the most multicultural suburbs in Australia. I really want Peter Dutton to come to Springvale and just walk down the street with me and see the contribution refugees are making. So, You, I'm sure, know of the approach that's taken in Canada, where families have a really integral role of bringing refugees into a new country and helping them establish themselves. And I think it's a great idea to try to replicate some of that. So I'm happy to go back to Canberra and talk to some of our senior leadership about that.
And maybe to ask them the question, how much weight does it bear when a community like ours says, our business is knowing people, and we know these people, and we know that what they're saying is right, and we are happy to support them. We can't support all of them, but we can certainly help with some of them. And I know there's other people that would be in the same mind.
To pick up on where Clare left off, firstly, Christy, respectfully, I'm not going to encourage you to run for Parliament as one of my constituents. But the truth is, Clare can do that, but it's not because of the absence of your energy or enthusiasm. It wouldn't be well placed in Canberra. It's actually because you and Rob and everybody else do amazing work in the community. And one of the reasons that I hold my particular philosophical bent is because I am a great believer in people and what they can do, rather than and particularly decentralised communities on the ground, rather than what we in Canberra can do. I'm very sceptical about what we can achieve. The work that's done, particularly for a lot of faith-based groups, because a lot of them are at the fore of these, of helping and supporting refugees, providing aid and assistance, and doing what I would argue Christ compelled people to do of a Christian faith or denomination, as well as the many other support services. And I think that's where my hope is that we're getting to, that we've got a sense and a perception, because Claire's right, Australians don't like people arriving by boat. They support a refugee program, but they support an ordered one and one that's managed, and because it isn't just the confidence that declines in the refugee program when it isn't, it's the decline in support for all migration overall. But then that you can actually move from an environment of conflict to one which is focused and anchored in not just compassion and humanity, but actually community. And that's where we should be getting to, because, as you said, and it goes right to answer the question I gave before, which is actually taking people on a journey of where we can all be a participant in that journey and improving the outcomes, because the day that somebody becomes a refugee and is resettled in a country like Australia, that's not the end, that's actually the beginning of an entirely new stage. And we can all play an enormous contribution as part of that.
Fantastic. I believe, Mr. Wilson, do you have a plane that you need to catch? So if you need to leave, you can feel free to do that. So any final questions for Mr. Wilson?
Can I just add, a number of aid agencies are working very solidly on the Canadian community sponsorship scheme and lobbying the parties on that. So just for you to be aware about that.
And to our next question.
Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah, I'd like to thank the panel for your time and effort. It's been a really interesting debate and I've really enjoyed it. But in many ways, I do feel that you're preaching to the converted. I mean, we're all here, a very engaged audience. We're concerned about our community. We want to make a change. And I just thought that on Thursday night, there were 90,000 people at the MCG watching AFL. How many of those people care about refugees, know about refugees, want to be engaged in the refugee debate? And as Tim said, it's about taking people on a journey, and I'm not convinced that we're doing enough to take those sort of people on a journey. And maybe it's about us all going home today and talking to our neighbour and saying refugees and seeing what comes up, and taking the debate further than just these walls. To me, I think the main issue is fear of the unknown. Timothy 1 said that it's in the poorest countries where they accept the most refugees. And it's basically because they identify with them, they usually are the same colour, there's no fear. And I still think that for the great majority of Australians, there's a fear of the unknown. And I think that's why over the last 10 years, as Shabnam said, there's been a marked difference in the reception of refugees and their behaviour. So how do we break down that fear of the unknown? How do we take people on a journey who aren't engaged don't know anything about refugees, and all they read about it is in the Herald Sun. So I think that's the issue that we have to try and look at politically, socially, and from a faith-based approach. Thank you.
I don't want to seem like I'm the guy who's hogging the microphone, but unfortunately I do have to catch a plane, so can I respond to that and leave it to the rest of the panel, if that's all right? The truth is that it's rarely solved by government. It's rarely solved by what you will read in the mass media. The mass media is a reflection of society back to itself. Where you can actually take people on that journey is at a community level. And one of the great challenges we have is that refugees tend to congregate generally in certain communities more and others less. And the Goldstein community, for instance, is one that's definitely in the lesser category. But that doesn't mean that people aren't doing good work. Brighton Lifesaving Club actively engages with bringing people from Clare's electorate out to the beach, because one of the problems we have is around drowning as a consequence of people not being able to swim, and so they have carnivals to deal with those sorts of things. The irony, of course, is the example you gave of the MCG. One of the most critical ways you can actually build community engagement across cultures is actually sport. And again, the way you do that is at a community level rather than doing it through national competition, so you might end up there. The same is true, we all know the most incredible contribution you can do to anybody's cultural integration and engagement is through their stomachs and the opportunity to have food and offerings. And so I would just say that the more you focus on the community side of it, I think the far more successful you're going to be, because when people go on that journey, people are often transformed and never come back. And we see this in lots of debates. And it's easy to demonise somebody you don't know, and you don't know their story. And so, yes, the truth is we are largely preaching converted today, but you've also heard stories which you can then go on and replicate, as I have too. And one of the most powerful things is to get people to be able to repeat those stories and to build those bridges so that gap between people just diminishes. Thank you.
I totally agree with what Tim just said, and it's very easy for us to sit back and make black and white judgmental statements about people we've never met. And so that's right across the board. It's actually getting to know the person behind the issue that starts to transform each and every one of us. And so with refugees, my encouragement is get to know refugees. We have a number of them who are part of our church community here. And there are plenty that you can find around the place, you know what I mean? And start to hear their stories, people like Shabnam, and sit down with them and have a coffee and listen and ask questions and hear their stories, and then share those stories with other people, or even, invite a few people together with a refugee family and just listen to their story, because as you start to do that, all your preconceived ideas start to go out the window, and you get to know the people rather than the issue. And that's where it becomes a heart connection rather than just thoughts in your mind. So I think it's just the most powerful thing to do.
Yep, I agree. I kind of slightly disagree with what Tim said before, the fact that, the community is the most important part of dealing with the whole problem. In the last 10 years that I have been in Australia, I keep seeing the community getting more and more disconnected from our political sphere, and I don't know why that is. I've travelled overseas. I've gone to Greece. I've worked at the refugee camps over there, and I always hear people say that, what is wrong with Australia? What's wrong with you people? Like your people, the community wants refugees. They're such big advocates, but then when it comes to government, it's completely the other way around. I was in Greece actually the first time when a professor from Italy was showing a video of the Australian government's campaign to stop the boats that was released overseas, and that we as members of community, we had no idea. It was the first time I was actually seeing that video of an Australian Defence Force official literally bluntly saying that if you come by boat to Australia, you will not make Australia home. We don't care if you have children or if you throw your children over or if you drown, whatever. You will not make Australia home. And that's the message that we are sending outside to the rest of the world, that that is the type of Australia we are, where I, as in from the community, I know that's not who we are. And maybe the solution is making the community work together with the politicians, with the politics, and the fact that we are, pushing the agenda so much is a start, but that's not enough. And I agree that we need to hear more refugee stories. And you need to go out and share those stories with others, but we need to do more than that. I, as a former refugee, want to be more than just a storyteller. It's gotten to a stage where I'm sick of sharing my story, to be honest, because it's not doing anything and it's so frustrating. I want us to work collaboratively, bring the refugees to the decision-making table. We're making decisions for refugees, but we are completely shutting them out of the whole process. It'd probably be better if we have a refugee sitting there and sharing their experience and say, oh, well, that will work with us, for us, or that won't work for us, going past the storytelling concept and, taking it further, not just work for refugees, work with refugees at the same time.
I believe we have a member of the Rohingya community with us this afternoon. They're at the back, past the mic, or at the front, sorry.
Hello, my name is Ali Gelato. I'm Oromo, from Oromo community. I was a refugee. Before I was a refugee, I was in prison when I was 16 years old. I lived in 3 different refugee camps in Kenya, including Kakuma. So I know what refugee is, I know what discrimination is, I know what torture is. But I came in 1999 to Australia as a refugee. Since then, I went to 4 different universities. I've got 3 masters. I'm a university lecturer at the moment. Australia is a good country. As a person, I want to help my community back. I've been working as a leader for about 5 years, try to improve different things for people. But my community, generally about 8 to 10,000 people in Australia, they've got brothers and sisters in a refugee camp in the neighboring countries. So they are our mortgage. Because we're trying to sponsor them, the Australian government always rejects them. So we keep sending money, half of what we earn here, we send back to refugee camp. So they're there for 10 years, 15 years, but they are recognized by UNHCR as a refugee. They've got mandate. They cannot go back. That is a long story, but recently there are 1.2 million people displaced by the government internally. About 50,000 refugees fled the last 3 weeks to Kenya because the government started shooting people around Moyales. So that's why there are about 50,000 people actually in Kenya at the moment. My question is that the World Vision and the Australian government actually know about this is actually what's happening. How someone like me who actually trying to help my people back home and in a refugee camp, help those people with the government, with World Vision, how we can actually work together to improve life for them, to give them hope, even if we don't solve the problem. That's my question. Thank you.
So, yeah, World Vision certainly knows about it. Excuse me. And your story is replicated so many times over. It's one of the reasons why community sponsorship, increasing the intake, we say to 42,000, is so important for Australia. The greatest displacement and numbers of refugees was after the Second World War. The world acted in concert to actually resettle them. To say now, when we are much richer than the world was at the end of a Second World War, too hard, is a nonsense. It's a nonsense, particularly when countries, Australia being one, give themselves a leave pass and say, well, technically we're still signed up to the UN Convention on Refugees. In practice, we're breaking it because it's just not playing well politically. To the earlier conversation, I agree with what everyone said about get to know a refugee, but I want to say this is actually not the way it's going to change. We can celebrate Turkish food and Vietnamese food. Very few, most Australians still aren't going to invite a Turk and a Vietnamese into their home. At best, we will live alongside each other. We won't live with each other. It's just the way human nature is wired. We, therefore, need policies that at best don't discriminate in housing or in education or in those areas, rather than thinking just enough Australians get to know a refugee, suddenly magically the government's attitude is going to change. The truth is, this is a failure at political level. The narrative that has been told to us Australians, and I have to say it started, in my view, with John Howard and the Tampa. It started with playing the race card, which Australian politicians would never, ever play, knowing where this leads to. The confusion of refugees as terrorists. The narrative that says if we took even one person from Manus or Nauru, all the boats would start again. This is complete fiction. This is utter and complete nonsense. It's actually got the groupthink in Canberra, in the Department of Immigration, convincing themselves with the minister that if we showed one bit of human kindness, we would suddenly have all the boats starting again. If that was going to happen, the boats would have started when Donald Trump took a few. This is actually a failure of political leadership. Look, the World Vision and other agencies know it doesn't matter how much we work in the community to say, let's increase our aid levels and get the grassroots to tell the politicians they want that. Richard Nixon was right. There ain't no votes in aid. The people who aid helps don't vote in Australian elections. The truth is, it was always bipartisanship agreement on keeping our aid levels high, on respecting the UN Convention on Refugees, on playing a fair share. It's the failure of those leaders and the narrative they've then used with fear that actually has to change. So whilst absolutely get to know refugees, welcome them, realise most Australians aren't ever going to do that. It's going to require leaders being leaders and true to what they've signed up to.
Would you like to?
Thank you so much for your question. I'm amazed at what you're doing here in Australia, and I want to thank you for your contribution, and it's really good that you're making that contribution now. I mean, the question that you're really asking is why is it so hard to get these family members and other people here? And I am dealing with just gut-wrenching examples that are just like ones of your family and friends, like horrible situations, like one that I'm working on at the moment. A woman, her niece and nephew are stuck in a refugee camp in Kenya at the moment, and everyone in their family has died in the war in Sudan, and the guardian of those two children has just died too, and they're there alone. They're basically being looked after in a foster care situation by a religious leader, but I can't get them to come to Australia. I must have raised it and written to Peter Dutton 12 times or something by now. Maybe it's a little bit less than that, but the problem is that our refugee program isn't big enough. And I talked a little bit before about at the last election, the political party that I'm in said we want to double the size of that refugee program, which doesn't quite get us to the World Vision target of 42,000, but it's not too far off, and certainly a dramatic change from what we have today. I really agree with some of the things that Tim has just said here. I think it's a nice thought that we can change community perceptions on a one person-to-person basis, but if I believe that was the way to do it, I wouldn't be in politics. I'm in politics because that gives me the possibility of talking to thousands, if not millions of people at once, and what politicians say powerfully changes how people think about public problems. And so, you know, again, coming back to this idea that the way people are being treated in the community when they are refugees, having changed over a decade, that terrifies me because it tells me that the politicians who I have seen politicise the issues of refugees over that decade are having an effect in the way that ordinary Australians are thinking about this problem. It doesn't reflect the best of who we are as a country, and how awful to think that, you know, we're travelling overseas and people are saying to us, oh, Australians are so racist, what's up with that? When it's not what I see in my community at all. You know, I represent one of the most multicultural communities in this country, and I want to take those people and bring them here to walk down the street with me and see what a richly multicultural and generous country we are. But that is not what's coming out, and it's clearly having an effect. You know, Tim talked about John Howard, and I'm certainly not here to pick on specific people, but, you know, he told Australians a lie about refugees coming to this country. He said that people on a boat had thrown their children in the water and said, well, we'll decide who comes into this country and the manner in which they come. And that turned out to be a lie, that we know that he knew that they didn't do that. I mean, what an awful, horrible thing to point the finger at some of the most persecuted people in the world and say, these are people that throw their children in the ocean to drown. So it's really no wonder that we're struggling with these issues, and politicians just have to rise above this and start to talk the truth about this, which is that refugees are making hugely positive contributions. And by the way, even if they weren't, we owe people at least that, because as we've talked about earlier, you know, none of us did anything to deserve the life chance we have of being born in Australia. So we have to try to share that opportunity with many more people.
To a friend up the back.
Hello, my name is Shafiqul Islam. I'm a Rohingya refugee here. We have nearly 1,000 of refugees in Melbourne area, especially in southeast Springville, around suburbs. So my question is particularly on Rohingya, especially who are in locally. So we have thousands of refugees here arrive here by boat because of, as you know, as you're aware, we've been facing persecutions for many decades. The facts of we've become refugees, or the most unwanted refugees, because we have taken some of our fundamental rights away, like education restriction in Burma for the generations. So we here today, we haven't been recognized that as a refugee. It's been taken 5 years, and we're still happy to obey the rules and law according to the government. But my point is, some of the realistic point is, some of our children who are studying in high school just simply ending up in high school. They have no further education rights, and some of the Australian-born Rohingyans are not receiving childcare benefits. So the boy here next to me, he came here by boat when he was 13 years old. His parents in Malaysia sent him to Australia to have education, a better life. And he finished high school, completed high school. There's no further education. And there are a lot of the children, Australian-born children, not receiving childcare benefits and education rights. So how do we get to get education rights for our community people in Australia? It is impacting our children's life. It is impacting our society, because it's look like stopping us to have our better life about it. This is the fundamental right. We should be given at least some of the fundamental rights in Australia.
Who would like to take that one?
So I'll say something very quick. So Shafiqul, thanks for your question. And Shafiqul is a constituent of mine, so we're well acquainted, and it's really great that you're here. If the community here wants to engage with the Rohingyas in Australia, Shafiqul's your man, because he's sort of leading their efforts here. I'll respond really quickly because I want everyone to have the chance to say something. So firstly, the problem that Shafiqul is talking about here is the fact that for people who came to Australia by boat, they have not been, so despite showing that they're refugees under the law, they've not been granted permanent status in Australia. This is one of the horrific cruelties of our refugee system here, because Shafiqul and the people he's sitting with back there, they've shown that they were persecuted. And now we're making them jump through an extra hoop, so they have to, they might get a temporary visa for 4 years, and then they have to show again at the end of 4 years that they're still in threat of being persecuted. That is a corrupt system. It is a horrible system that simply takes people who've been persecuted and subjects them to a life of living in limbo, because the people in this community can't set down roots, and they can't, as Shafiqul points out, they can't get educated. Like, what kind of silly decision to provide people the opportunity to stay in Australia, but by the way, you're not going to be allowed to go to university or to get to go to TAFE. So the quick political answer is that Labor is going to get rid of those visas. So if you're a refugee, you prove you're a refugee, and then you just get to stay, because that is just a silly way to manage a refugee program. If you're here, we really want you to be here. We want you to set down roots and make a contribution. So that's Labor's policy.
So we'll try to get to all of the other members of the panel on this one. We could start with Vanessa, if we could. There's another chance yet.
I'm not actually sure how World Vision can assist in that one. I guess that's where it, in speaking for World Vision, it's a little bit difficult. I would definitely say, though, as a country, we need to show a greater deal of compassion. With the numbers that I showed you before, of the 65 million people that have been forcibly displaced, only 2.8 million of those have got to the point where they have registered as asylum seekers. They're in camps for up to 17 years, and they finally get to a point they really want to go home. That's their option, and they hold out for that as long as possible. So I'm really happy that you guys have arrived here, and I wish that we were doing more for you. But always remember that by the time someone goes to seek asylum, they've gone through potentially decades of time in refugee camps and seeking asylum. And that's why I thank you guys for coming out here today to actually support that cause and to take time out of your Sunday afternoon to discuss it.
So were there any final comments or statements that our panel members wanted to make?
I just really want to thank everyone for coming today. And, I know that Glenford mentioned that, this is in a group of people in one room, but we all represent more people, and we all have influence in the lives of other people. And I understand fully, dealing with things at a political level, but as a pastor of a community here, I don't have responsibility over everyone in Australia, but we can influence people at a community level. And so we've all got to do what we can do. And I just so appreciate the Rohingya guys right at the back. And I want to meet you and chat with you. And I thank you for coming to this today. Absolute gold. Thank you.
Same along the lines, those lines. Thank you for coming here, and that shows that you are dedicated, you care about the issue. But can I just say that don't be disappointed if things don't go as you plan them to be, or also don't get too complacent as well. Don't get too happy with your achievements. There's so much more we can do, but look after yourself as well. There's so much more we can do. Keep pushing. I feel like personally the whole refugee movement has got more momentum in the last 2 years than it has ever had during my time here in Australia, at least. And that's because people are pushing it. We're no longer just satisfied with our own achievements. We want to do more. We want to get people who can make that change to actually stick to their words and do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Shabnam. That was beautifully said. I wish you were Essendon's football coach. That's my team. Try harder, but don't want the impossible. By the way, I'm declaring the peptide strategy a success of the last 4 years. We're back. Seriously, I think Vanessa has said, what can World Vision do? Back at the Indo-Chinese disaster, end of the Vietnam War, so many boats of Indo-Chinese, Vietnamese on the sea, World Vision was shocked that so many neighbouring governments were pushing these boats away. And just like they did 2 years ago to the Rohingya, you might remember, when they were fleeing and trying to get to ports. World Vision bought a ship called Sea Sweep and started picking up the Indo-Chinese and trying to land them at these governments until we embarrassed them with an international campaign to actually accept these people. Then nations like Australia stepped in and said, it was Malcolm Fraser, we will take them. And that's why we've got Vietnamese restaurants today. So the Rohingya has shocked me, and I just want to acknowledge the person being here. It's the closest I've seen in my 14 years with World Vision to what I regard, I didn't live through it, but to what I regard as the fate of Jews in Germany in the 1930s. This is what really has shocked me. The truth is, rational, caring, professional Burmese have almost a visceral hatred of the Rohingya. It's irrational. It's almost like of the 125 minorities and ethnic groups in Burma, one thing that unites that nation is a hatred of the Rohingya. It is quite shocking to actually be there and see. So I certainly believe that Australia's priority, you heard me speak to that earlier, should be actually saying our region. What are we doing here? And I just salute those who are in the community to be voices for what's going on.
So that concludes this afternoon's forum. Thank you so much all for coming. It's really valuable to have all of us engaged in the democratic process rather than just watching it go on and sitting on the sidelines. So thank you all so much. Thank you all to our speakers. Could you please join me in thanking them for their contributions? It's been really fascinating, really wonderful to hear all of their views. So I hope you all have a fantastic afternoon and, yeah, blessed week. Thank you.